This is Graduate a CEO, what it takes and what it means to become an entrepreneur, and why college is the perfect time to start your business. Here's Jim Hunter.
Today I'm joined by Ryan Mason, the owner of Roast Coffee Company. Ryan is a true leader in the coffee industry with over 25 years of experience and a passion for quality coffee. Ryan's impact on the coffee industry cannot be overstated. He's credited with creating an espresso bar catering concept that has revolutionized the way brand-driven companies, major entertainment venues, concert halls, and convention centers approach coffee. Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, great. We've had many discussions in the past, and this is one that we're going to enjoy getting caught up on where you are today, but we'll also talk about your history. You attended UW-Milwaukee, and you noted a lack of coffee shops on and around the campus nearly 20 years ago. What was your initial vision for the company?
Before I started the coffee shop, I actually wanted to start a manufacturing business that made coffee makers. And then when I started to do some of the research for that, I realized that it was a huge financial burden and something that I couldn't afford at that particular time. So I had always worked in coffee shops throughout college and throughout school. And I took a step back and said, all right, I know coffee. I know the coffee shop world. Why don't I start a coffee shop? So being a UWM graduate, I realized there was no coffee shops on campus or around campus at that particular time. So I kind of picked a location that was a couple of blocks away from UW-Milwaukee and essentially opened Roast.
That sounds very easy. You just picked a place and opened up, and there you were. That's not really true. I know your history, but give us a little bit of the story.
That is not true. It's looking back at it, I have to kind of take a couple steps back and say, at that particular time, I guess I would call it a benefit of not knowing what I was truly getting myself into. So when I started the company, I had always wanted to own and operate a company in particular. And all I can remember is when I was young, business is what I was drawn to. So I had spent a little time out in industry and working with my degree, and I realized that wasn't the place that I wanted to be. And starting a company was really where my heart and my head was. So when I ended up starting Roast, my story goes that I found the location, and when I reached out to the landlord, he essentially shot me down right away and said, "You have no money. Why am I going to lease you this space?" And basically hung up on me. And at that particular point, I realized, I don't have any money. All I have is a business plan of what I want to do, and I needed to find some money in order to start this. So it just so happened one of my buddies invited me out for drinks one night, and we met up with a couple of friends from college, and one happened to be a commercial lender for a bank. So as we got talking, she realized my character, who I was, what I was doing, and we arranged to have a meeting and showed her my business plan, and she was able to push it through and give me some funding. So in addition to that,
now wait a minute. This was a bank funding a brand new company, starting from ground zero, and you got a bank loan. How in the world was that possible?
At the end of the day, I kind of look back and scratch my head on that one too. The person that I was working with was new to her job as well. And part of it, I think, was trying to find businesses that she could finance. And since she knew me and knew my character and saw my business plan, we were able to kind of do a dry run through the business plan to find out what I needed in order to essentially, tee up this loan. So at that particular time, I wasn't asking for what I considered a lot of money, but back then, as you mentioned, a new business, zero track record, being young, I don't exactly know how it got pushed through and actually got the loan. But I got a term loan and also a line of credit as well.
Well, that's great. In the entrepreneurship class that I have taught for many years, we have a financing class, and there are 4 C's of credit: collateral, conditions, capacity, and the fourth one is character. And
Correct.
people somewhat discount that one, but I think you got your loan almost purely on character alone. Amazing.
Yeah, looking back, I think that's pretty accurate.
Well, that was very fortunate. Tell us more about what happened next.
I got a bank loan, line of credit, and also my parents ended up going out to dinner with some old family friends. The family friends had ended up, someone had passed away per se, and they had some money. And they had wanted to start a coffee shop for as long as they can remember. They were at that particular point in their age where they didn't want to put in the work associated with it. So, they said to my parents, we'd really love to talk to Ryan to figure out, if this is an investment that we're willing to put in. So when my parents initially called me about this, I kind of pushed them off and said, I'm working with a banker right now. I'm trying to get this particular bank loan. And they had called me back a couple days later and said, no, Ryan, you really need to call them. I called them out of respect, and we had the conversation, sent over the business plan to them. And a couple days later, they said, this is exactly what we want to do. We've got this money. Why don't we go ahead and, invest it with you? Send us, your term sheet and your offer letter. And at that particular point, I had no idea what those particular documents were, but had to get a attorney involved in order to draft up some of those so that way we could do an investment into the company.
Well, how did you get an attorney?
So that was another funny story where I go up to a buddy's cabin every 4th of July, and we were goofing around. I ended up breaking my arm, and I was sidelined from all the water activities through, the whole weekend. Plopped myself on the shoreline next to this particular woman, got talking to her and asked her what she did for a living. And she said, I'm an attorney. And, I just kind of threw my hands up in the air and laughed a little bit and said, well, what kind of attorney are you? And she said, well, I mostly deal with contracts and business law. And I said, all right, do you know what a term sheet is? And can you do an offer letter for a stock offering? And she kind of asked me my background and what I was doing. And I told her I was trying to start a coffee shop and I had an investor that was willing to invest some money, but additionally needed some paperwork as well. And she said, no problem, handed me her card, and got together that following week and were able to put these documents together for, this investment in the company.
Well, another personal contact. It sounds like that worked out up to that point.
It sure did.
What happened next?
So once I had the bank loan, the line of credit, I had put some of my money in, and then we had the investor in. I called back the landlord of the particular space and said, hey, listen, there's some things that have drastically changed in my background here, and is this space still for lease? We went through it and basically decided that there was an option here to carry on. Since I did have the money and they were looking to lease out the space, we were able to come to terms on what the business was going to become. So at that particular time, the building itself was an old art gallery. So it was about 3,000 square feet. The building itself had 4 storefronts on the main level. So what I proposed was to basically subdivide the space to where I would get the corner location for about 1,200 square feet. Since it was an old art gallery, we were kind of starting from basically scratch, state of being zero, where we had to add all the plumbing, all the electrical, and all of the HVAC work. When we started talking about the lease negotiation, one thing that I really tried to do was I didn't want to pay for the lease until their portion of the build out was done. They meaning the landlord. And since it was basically a white vanilla box, we had to put in all the bathrooms. Like I mentioned, all the plumbing, all the electrical work. And we had negotiated that they were going to do a portion of the build out and then I was going to do the rest. And my whole goal was to then team up with them and their tradespeople. So that way, when their portion of the build out got finished, hopefully mine was close behind. And then that's when we negotiated to start paying for rent.
Okay, well, how did it go? Sounds like you've got a project underway.
Project's underway. Yep. We got all the tradespeople in there to start doing the demolition of the space. And while I started it, we ended up running into a couple of problems. I got a call from the landlord, and he basically said, Ryan, we got an issue here. The water main going into the building isn't large enough to suffice your equipment and everything else that we're adding to this space. At that particular time, I didn't know what that meant, and I said, well, what does this mean? And he's like, well, you got to figure this was 20 years ago, and he's like, the water main going into the building is basically going to cost us $10,000 in order to replace. And I said, wow, who's going to take care of this cost? And he said, well, it's something that we didn't know. It's an older building, so we're gonna take care of this and finish it off. So, in my mind, I'm thinking to myself, wow, I just dodged a $10,000 bullet. So as things went on, the work started to progress. I got another call from the landlord, and he said, we got another problem. He said, you're in violation of the 150-foot rule. And I said, what on God's earth is a 150-foot rule? And he said, you can't have two electrical panels on the same building within 150 feet of each other. And I said, well, let me guess. Mine's closer than that. He said, yeah. And I said, well, what do we have to do for this? And he said, well, what they're requesting is basically for you to create a separate space for basically a cocoon for your space, which means that we need to drywall the walls, the ceilings, the basement, everything else, and basically separate your space for the rest of the building in the event that we do have a fire. So he said, call up your architect, figure out what it's going to cost, and get back to me. I called my architect, and he's like, I can't see this costing less than $42,000. And I said, I don't have $42,000. I don't have a contingency fund with a bunch of cash just sitting there. And I'm like, this will bankrupt me. I had a huge knot in my stomach. I the emotions that I was going through at that particular time were just unheard of. And I knew I needed to call back the landlord to kind of give him this news. So I put on my best face, gave him a phone call, and said, listen, I got a number. It looks like it's going to cost about $42,000 in order to do this work. I said, who's going to take care of this? Are you? And he said, not this time. And I said, well, we need to have a plan B conversation here because I don't have the money in order to, finance this right now. I'm like, if I have to do this, honestly, I will go bankrupt. And he's like, all right, let me think about this for a second. And at that particular point in time, he was one of the largest real estate holding companies in the state of Wisconsin. And he made a few phone calls to basically some folks in Milwaukee. And it transitioned up to a county level and eventually ended up at a state level to try to figure out if I needed to abide by this 150-foot rule. So at this particular point in time, building pretty much stops for all the electrical work. Can't continue. Job shuts down. So all the other trades people can work, but I'm thinking in the back of my mind is if I have to do this, I'm going bankrupt. I don't have the money to pay these people. So at that particular point, I'm kind of caught in a catch-22 of like, well, do I have the building continue or do I stop it entirely? And, as weeks started going by, there's people from both sides of the aisle coming in. I had people from my landlord's side coming in to look at the space. There's people from the state side coming to look at the space and trying to figure out if I needed to abide by this particular rule. About 6 weeks into it, they finally came to a ruling and decided that I did not need to abide by it because of some historical codes. And because of that, I was able to continue the work. So once that happened, it was, pretty remarkable that, I was able to fend off bankruptcy even before I started the business.
Well, that's great. You're off and running now, but you're not quite done.
Not quite there.
Okay, what did you need to do to get to the point of opening up?
Once that, as I call it, freed up, things started kind of falling into place. All my equipment was coming in. I started hiring the staff. Everything was just coming together in order for, the cafe to finally open. The last piece that I was really waiting for was all my furniture, all the cafe tables, all the chairs. And I called up the person that I ordered it from, and I got a disconnected number. And I had thought that I misdialed the number, so I called again, and sure enough, disconnected. And 20 years ago, when cell phones weren't that popular, I picked up this person's cell phone and called that, and it had a message that said, I no longer work at this particular company. So I jumped in my car at the time, drove down to the place where I bought all the furniture from, and I pull up, and they're pulling out tables and chairs from the front of the building. They're taking down the awnings from the front of the buildings. Computers are going out the back door. I walk in, I'm like, what's going on? And they said, we went out of business. And I said, well, where does that leave me with all my furniture? And they said, well, we sold all the contracts to this particular company, so you'll need to call them to find out. So got on the phone with that person, and I said, hey, Ryan Mason, Roast Coffee Company. I'm trying to find out where my furniture is with this particular company that went out of business. And she laughed. And I said, why are you laughing? And she said, this thing's a mess. She's like, best case scenario is they took the contract that you signed for this furniture, and they sent it to the company in order to manufacture it. Best case scenario is your furniture is sitting on a loading dock somewhere, ready to be shipped out. She's like, worst case scenario, they never sent your contract in, and therefore we're starting from square zero. And I said, where does that leave us? And she said, I'm going to have a couple days to figure this out. As I'm waiting for that, a couple days later, she calls and says, listen, good news. Some of it, furniture went in production, some of it didn't. What we're going to do is take care of the payment in order to get it put into full production, and we'll give you a call when it's ready. I ended up getting a call back a few weeks later, and they said, everything is here at our loading dock. Let's schedule a time to deliver. I said, all right, great, let's do it tomorrow. And she laughed again and said, we're 6 weeks out on delivery time. And I said, well, what can I do? And she said, well, you can come pick it up yourself. So, that's what I did. I borrowed one of my buddy's trucks and drove out to the loading dock. And, honestly, me not knowing how furniture comes, I didn't realize it came in big boxes. And I'm looking at the stack of tables and chairs and these big boxes, and I'm looking at the bed of my truck, and I'm like, I'm going to be doing this for the next week. So I talked to one of the shop floor managers and said, what can we do about this? Can we get this on one of your trucks to drive down? And I'm like, this is the last piece that I need to open my cafe. And one of the guys happened to live on the east side of Milwaukee and said, you know what? He's like, I'm willing to drive my box truck down there and basically unload this equipment for you. I called up all my buddies and I said, bring your toolbox. I'll buy pizzas. I'll buy beer. Let's assemble this. This is the last step that I need in order to open up. So once we got everything all set and ready to go, we ended up opening up February 2nd of 2004.
Fantastic. What a milestone. Now, you opened up and you had trained and hired staff, had you?
I did, yes.
How did that work out?
Well, again, not knowing the complexities of the retail coffee shop or what to even expect, I had essentially overhired. So I had hired about 10 people in order to work in the cafe. I hired them away from other coffee shops. I trained them up under the specific methods and techniques that we were using to make our coffee, put a lot of time and energy into them. Once I opened up, it never crossed my mind to think, like, if I don't hit my financials, what's going to happen? Like, I guess I just thought that once you open, things were just going to work out. And I quickly found out that I was a brand new company, undercapitalized, and I've got a staff that I'm paying that is essentially not busy enough to have the large staff that I had. So in order to save money, I essentially cut half of my staff and basically said, sorry, I know I put all this time and energy into you. I know you quit jobs in order to be here, but, we're not going to make it if, I have this big a staff and I don't have the hours to give you. So I ended up letting half my staff go.
That's pretty painful.
It is, yeah. You think about trying to run this business, to a certain degree, opening it was the easiest thing that I did. But to actually make it work was one of the hardest things. Because you are starting from basically scratch, you have to build your customer base. You have to find out what you're good at. And, you have to really work it. So, one of the things I knew is, how to hire and train people. But then, with my HR background, I had to essentially let a lot of people go as well. But as I started digging into the business and trying to figure out what we were good at, I realized we were really good at our methods and techniques for making coffee. And then I started to, expand the menu. So once I started to expand the menu, I started to add what I would consider fun drinks that more people were used to, and started building the business that way.
So that was to attract and retain customers, and I assume that you started with a kind of meager client base, and then it grew from there.
Correct. I mean, a lot of it was that when I started, I was very traditional in my coffee making methods. I thought people really enjoyed drinking espressos and cappuccinos and very traditional Italian based drinks. And what I discovered is that, being around a college campus, most of the experience that people had into our area was their coffee shops from back in their hometown. And a lot of it had to do with a lot of specialty based drinks. And that's kind of what we started to focus on is like, all right, how can we make these drinks fun and enjoyable for all these college students? So we started looking at some of the specialty drinks and started creating our own. So we started creating basically the recipes for it and eventually growing out the business that way. And it only got to a certain point where it's just like, all right, we can only raise our prices so much. We can only create so many drinks at this particular time. So how are we going to grow the business in the next level? And like I said, when I started, I was very traditional with what I wanted. I wanted pretty much traditional espresso-based drinks and pastries, and that was it. And I realized that what I had envisioned and what I'd written my business plan for wasn't successful in my location. And one of the things that I needed to do was essentially serve food. I started checking into what it would take in order to serve food at the cafe because I needed to be relicensed. And they told me I needed a grease trap, essentially. So I got some quotes for some plumbers for some grease traps. And, it was money that I couldn't afford at the time. It ended up being a huge expense. So one of my customers basically said, I'm hearing all about this grease trap. What is it? So I explained it to him. He's like, how much is it going to cost? And I showed him the estimate. He's like, wow, that's a lot of money. And he's like, I got half of it. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he's like, I'll write you a check for half of this right now if you use it to put in a grease trap. He's like, I've been coming here since day one. He's like, I live in the neighborhood. I understand the economics of a business because I own one. And additionally, I would rather see a business here on this corner rather than an empty storefront. He said, if you think your next jump is to serve food, he's like, I'll write you a check for half of this amount right now. I had asked him, what do you need in return? And he said, give me coffee credit. And I said, that's a lot of coffee credit. And he's like, I know. And he's like, but I believe in you and I believe in the shop, so I'm willing to take that risk. So he had written me a check that particular day. I called up the plumber. We got the grease trap installed. And the day that I started serving food, our sales jumped 30%. And that's essentially what I think kept me in business until this particular point.
Wow, that's a wonderful story and a testament to you and the bond with your customers. Okay, Ryan, it's time to take a break, but coming up in the second part of my conversation with Ryan Mason, the owner of Roast Coffee Company, Ryan talks about the impact relationship building has had on his business.
One thing that I think is really important is the way that you do business. I don't believe in screwing people. I only believe that what good you put out should come back to you. Relationships are a big portion of what I do.
This has been Graduate a CEO with Jim Hunter. If you'd like to connect with Jim and learn more about why you should consider starting a business while in college, go to jameshunter.com. Graduate a CEO is a production of Advantage Audio.